Good morning. Delighted to be with you here this morning. Now, I received a wonderful, perfect message really from my daughter. This morning when I was getting ready for the talk, she said, "Good luck, Dad, and have fun." So, but in the name of having fun, I'd like to share with you this picture. I hope you can see it. This was part of the inspiration for this talk. This little fawn here was born about an hour before I snapped the picture, just right outside my window. It put me in a very good mood for talking about what I want to talk to you about today, which is shifting to a new image of the human being and how nonviolence is going to play a key role in that, and how all of us in turn can feed into that great revolution. So that was the wrong button here. Let's start off with a question. Why are these two guys smiling? This is Derek Oakley and Andres Gutierrez. They're working with an organization called the Nonviolent Peace Force, and they're smiling because they have just shown us the way to get out of war. They were in a camp, in a UN-based refugee camp for internally displaced persons, and suddenly there was a militia attack on that camp. 58 people were killed. Derek and Andres went for shelter into a little mud hut where they found women and children huddling there in terror. The militia came in with AK-47s and axes and spears and ordered these two men out with the obvious purpose of killing everybody who was in that hut. Andres and Derek were well trained. They had formed good teamwork. They knew exactly what they were doing. They glanced at one another. They looked in the eye of the militias and they said, "We're not leaving." 3 times these men came in and tried to get Derek and Andres out, and 3 times they refused to go. And in the last analysis, it was the militia that went away and left the women and children safe behind them. So these 2 heroes of ours did exactly what they were trained to do. They were trained in part of this organization, Nonviolent Peace Force, which has 200 well-trained field team actors operating in some of the most dangerous places in the world. And they, in turn, are part of a movement called Unarmed Civilian Peacekeeping. I'm glad you're hearing about that from me, because you will not hear about it from the newspaper or the mass media. There is no app for Unarmed Civilian Peacekeeping, UCP. But it's one of the most important things that's happening in our world. And in turn, so we're going from an organization, Nonviolent Peace Force, to an institution, a new model, Unarmed Civilian Peacekeeping, and that in turn is part of a revolution, a quiet revolution that's happening in the growth of nonviolence throughout the world. You are probably not aware. When you're a nonviolent scholar, you get to say this a lot. You're probably not aware. You're probably not aware that nearly 2/3 of the people in the world today live in a country where there has been a major nonviolent movement or campaign of some kind. About 40 years ago, 2/3 of the world was under authoritarian rule, and now that's down to 1/3, mainly because of nonviolent insurrections. So there's still a more important job, I would say, that Derek and Andres are doing for us, and that is they are giving us a new image of the human being. And boy, do we need one. This ad is going to say a lot about where our present image comes from. Here's a handsome dude in a very slick sports car. You can see his expression from where you're sitting. He's kind of looks like he's in an action movie, burning up the road in the sports car, and he's very happy because the heartbeats per minute is mimicking the engine RPM. Isn't that wonderful? And if you really zero in, I don't know if you can read this, it says, "Don't just drive the car, be the car." In other words, please remember that this is not a one-off. This isn't something you just see and then go back to the real life where you interact with people. If you live in our country, you are seeing between 3,000 and 5,000 commercial messages every day. And every one of those messages has this subtext, as we'd like to call it, that you are a physical entity, separate from others, separate from the planet, separate even from yourself, and that you are desperately dependent on competing for external resources for your fulfillment. So, and this is just advertising. There's also, the action movies and all the rest of it. So we are being bombarded with a false and very dismal image of who we are. And I think the world is struggling to get out of that image. And where we're going to get the resources to get out of it are from the great heroes of nonviolence, among other places. It was Martin Luther King who said, "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented civilization to a person-oriented civilization." And if you haven't guessed by now, I am here today to inspire you to join us in helping to make this shift happen. A shift from a thing-oriented civilization where violence is inevitable to a person-oriented civilization where nonviolence is natural. One of the things that's going to help us in this shift is science. Mahatma Gandhi once said, when he was asked by some of his coworkers, "Why are people giving you so much trouble? Why are you having so much grief?" And he said, "New ideas or old ideas in a new form are bound to cause confusion and consternation." Well, it turns out that nonviolence is an old idea, a very old idea. And with this wonderful turnaround that's happened in science in the last 30 or 40 years, where science was all about reductionism, how we're caused by our genes and all of that, to this marvelous new exploration of what a human being can truly be. I would have stayed in the sciences. I'm not a college dropout, by the way. I would have stayed in the sciences if I had any inkling that it was going in this direction. So one of the brilliant researchers who works in animal behavior is Franz Duval, who performed the following experiment back in 1996. You have a picture here of a rhesus monkey, because there's going to be a kind of bad primate, good primate model. So these characters are pretty nasty. I think I recognize this one from my days in New York. I think I saw him on the subway one time. They are aggressive. They're a very aggressive animal. So the experiment was to take a much less aggressive species and put it in with the rhesus and see who won. The stumptail family is a much, as you can tell. Of course, I've chosen the slide to make them look cute, but the fact is that stumptails are much less aggressive. So they put the stumptails in with the rhesus and then stepped back to see what would happen. They're kind of unkind of them, but that's how science works sometimes. To their amazement, the stumptail monkeys were able to hold their own against the rhesus monkeys. The rhesus would come up to a stumptail and say, "Hey, get off of my branch." And the stumptail would say, "No, thank you. I was here first. I'm going to stay. And if you're really having a problem, you can bite me, but I'm not leaving." So what we're seeing here is a kind of proto-nonviolence. I'm going to explain why I say that in a minute. But not only were the stumptails able to resist the rhesus monkeys, but to their amazement, within a short period of time, the rhesus monkeys actually started imitating the stumptails. And then they took the stumptails out to see how long it would take for the rhesus to go back to their same old, and guess what? They didn't. So even in our inheritance from nature, in our evolution, there are preliminary to nonviolent mechanisms which are powerful and robust. Now, I said that this is proto-nonviolence because for human beings, of course, there's another element of choice. We can't rely on our evolutionary inheritance or our programming. Oops. Let's see. Yeah. What we need to have is something called priming. Psychologists use this term priming to mean when you change your attitude, it enables you to behave and respond differently to situations. There are thousands of very interesting examples of that. In one case, two researchers from Princeton, Mary Wheeler and Susan Wisk, were able to show that by simply asking you, do you think the person we're about to show you a picture of likes crunchy peanut butter or smooth peanut butter, they were able to suppress a reaction that comes from deep in the reptilian brain, which causes us to go into a fight or flight response when we see a face of somebody from a different race. So just by thinking of that person as a human being and not as a category, suddenly you are able to actually suppress an operation, a function that was deep in the reptilian brain. And what I'm showing you a picture of here, I would call the ultimate priming. This is a famous photograph of Mahatma Gandhi, who's obviously in a state of very deep meditation. This enabled him in April of 1930 to pick up a pinch of salt off the shore at Dandin and bring down the British Empire. He had the genius and the courage to tackle the biggest empire the world had ever seen and to bring it to its knees without firing a shot and end up in a situation where the British and the Indians are friends. It also enabled him to win people over. Here you see him a year later at the Lancashire cloth mills, and these women are all people whom he had put out of work with his cloth boycott. And yet within 1 hour, they're going, "Hip hip hooray!" And there's little Gandhi standing in the middle. So now I'd like to come down to modern times in our own country and show you a picture of someone whom you may have heard of, but you will probably not have heard of what the significance is of what she did. Her name is Antoinette Tuff. She was an administrator at a children's school in Decatur, Georgia, and it is one of the few cases in recent history where a school massacre did not happen. And it didn't happen because a very deranged young man walked into the school loaded with weapons, and instead of, she overmastered her fear, which is the first thing you have to do in nonviolence, and looked him in the eye and said, "You have problems, I understand, I have problems too. Do you want to hear about my divorce?" And she said, "I love you, you know, you're gonna be okay, and I think you've made the right decision. Put your gun on the table, lie down on the floor, and tell me when it's all right to call the police." Now, the interesting thing, you probably have heard about this much from the mass media, but the interesting part you haven't heard is how we had security systems in place which are based on our old story, our false model of reality and the human being, and they failed. There was a security gate. This fellow slipped right by. There were police outside firing weapons, making things much worse. But the one thing that did work was a human being who had inner capacities and was able to mobilize them in that moment of emergency, that moment. And we do nothing to cultivate the thing that worked, and we spend billions of dollars cultivating stuff that doesn't work. This is why I'm so enthusiastic about getting you on board to help us in that shift. So how do we do that? Well, at our organization, the Meta Center, that's Meta with 2 T's, it's the Compassion Center, not the Beyond Center. We have built a model of the shift, of the entire peace movement, nothing more nor less than that. And I don't think I have a lot of time to go through all the details of it with you. It's on our website. But what I would like to do is zoom in on the inner circle where it all begins, which is a circle that we call person power. And we have 5 almost equally unpleasant suggestions to make about how we can benefit ourselves and make ourselves capable of making our full contribution, playing our full role in this absolutely essential shift. The first and most unpleasant, but most essential, is to avoid the mass media. You know, we used to say to people, just be careful not to watch the violence and the vulgarity on the mass media. And they said to us, well, if we take out the violence and the vulgarity, there's nothing left. We said, okay, you know, sell your television, whatever it takes. It is absolutely essential for us to get these images and these stories out of our head. When we have done that, there's going to be kind of a cultural vacuum in us because we spent so much time exposing ourselves to those stories. How are we going to fill up the vacuum? Hi, we have a suggestion. Learn everything that you can about nonviolence. Learn the stories, learn the history, learn the theory, be conversant with it. It's a fascinating, incredible, untold story. And it'll make you feel much better, much more proud about being a human being. I was giving a talk at Gandhi birthday in India last year, and they were saying how proud they were to be Indians. I say, I completely agree with you, but because Gandhi lived, I'm proud to be a human being. Thirdly, if you haven't already done so, we strongly suggest that people take up a spiritual practice, like meditation. That's what made Gandhi what he became. And we may be able to help you find a meditation style that works for you. Finally, you will be a very changed person when you've done all these three things. So go out and interact with other people in a more personal way. Finally, find your passion, go out there and get a project to work on, and when you're doing it, tell the new story. The new story, I think we can reduce to 4 simple points and still make it very powerful. And by the way, let me point something out here. These are not bullet points, okay? Too violent. These are spinning wheel points. I don't know if you can see that, but this is the new style. 21st century, we do spinning wheel points, not bullet points. Good, okay. I feel good about that. First, remember that as spiritual beings, you know, Gandhi had a coworker called Asha Devi who was challenged one time and someone said, didn't Gandhi overlook the limits of human nature? She said, there are no limits to human nature. She said, thinking of us not as physical beings, of course, but as spiritual beings, where we are much more deeply interconnected with one another and the planet than we can be on the physical level. Remember always that we have freedom and responsibility. We have moral agency. Science and the ancient wisdom traditions have proven that your genes cannot tell you what to do, your hormones cannot tell you what to do. It's your own priming and your own attitude. Remember that we have inner resources, and above all, remember that we are capable of nonviolence. We are capable of being nonviolent, even in desperate situations, and we are capable of responding to nonviolence when we encounter it. Thank you very much.